I think for me, what keeps me coming back to these small teams is the ability to move quickly. Like, I have no patience. I just want to move fast. Like, I don't want to go through a bunch of red tape to get things done. So there's that element of it. And I just kind of like having autonomy and ownership over projects. So, as opposed to, again, having to like run something by 5 different people before it's published, I like being able to kind of come up with the strategy, come up with the execution, and really just own the whole process from beginning to end.
Every B2B marketing team faces challenges when they have to do more with less. Should you build skills internally? Should you find a freelancer? Should you search for the right agency? This is Tech Qualified, a podcast for the scrappy B2B marketing teams. In each episode, Meredith Metsker, a senior content leader at a tech company, and Justin Brown, a marketing agency owner, uncover how marketing teams generate qualified opportunities with limited resources. Every episode helps you get one step closer to winning over your ideal customers.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Tech Qualified. I'm Justin Brown, and I'm joined by my co-host, as always, Meredith Metsker.
Hey, everyone.
This show is brought to you by New North. New North specializes in working with B2B marketers who have to do more with less. When you partner with New North, you turn your small, scrappy marketing team into a growth engine. One of the things we'll be doing on this show is having some conversations without guests, but between Meredith and myself. And to steer those topics, we're going to actually discuss interviews that we did on this show and how we felt about the subject matter, what that meant to us, and give each other prompts from those episodes to steer the conversation. So to start, we're going to talk about the conversation that we had with Rachel Cottom around the difficulties and fears of being a small content marketing team of one. So to get started, Meredith, what continues to draw you to be a small but mighty content marketing team of one?
Yeah, it's a good question because there are a lot of challenges, as you mentioned, and as Rachel mentioned in her episode too. But I think for me, what keeps me coming back to these small teams is the ability to move quickly. Like, I have no patience. I just want to move fast. Like, I don't want to go through a bunch of red tape to get things done. So there's that element of it. And I just kind of like having autonomy and ownership over projects. So, as opposed to, again, having to like run something by 5 different people before it's published, I like being able to kind of come up with the strategy, come up with the execution, and really just own the whole process from beginning to end. So those are just a couple of things that appeal to me about it. Yeah.
How do you see that you're able to get things shipped more effectively as a small team? Do you find that it's actually easier when you're a small team and people are like, I don't have the time to review your work, you just gotta get it live? Do you find that sometimes your work is getting reviewed by, and this doesn't have to even be in your current role, because I know this isn't the first time you've been small content marketing team of one. Do you find sometimes that your work because I've heard this myself, right? Like, it's no secret. We hear Dave Gerhardt say all the time, marketing people should go work at a company that understands market, or go work for a CEO that understands marketing. And I think one of the reasons that he and other people say that is because you don't want to have situations where you can never have things go live. So how do you find that working on a small marketing team, you're actually able to get your work live and be more proactive in your marketing?
Yeah, well, it's absolutely easier, in my opinion, to get things done on a smaller team. And I have worked kind of in both scenarios. My last couple jobs have been in smaller marketing teams where I was the only content marketer, but I have worked in places where I was one of many kind of content type people. Mm-hmm. And in one of those scenarios, I worked in a university, which, if anyone who has worked in higher ed, as they know, there's a lot of red tape in a university. There's a lot of layers you have to go through to get approval on things. And
I've sold to higher ed many times.
It's
tough.
It's tough.
we sold a big deal. I won't use the university's name, but we were doing an entire online class curriculum. And I think 2 to 3 semesters went by before the project started from the day that I had my first. It's like a year and a half. I didn't think the deal would ever happen. I was just like, I'll keep talking to them. Like, it doesn't hurt me to this lady wants to keep the conversation going. She's like, I promise we're going to do this. I'm like, it's been 18 months. Are you sure you don't want to just, and we ended up doing the project. But anyway, continue. Yes, it is red tape galore. I probably met 25 people throughout that time.
Yes. Yep. That sounds about right. And, I suppose there's some benefits to that in terms of like keeping your brand very solid and consistent across the board. But for me, it was really tough because I like to move fast. I like to like start and complete projects in a reasonable time frame. And so I eventually left higher ed for the private sector largely for that reason, because I wanted to move faster. And so I think working on a smaller team, again, it allows that autonomy, allows that speed. And if you're in a scenario like mine right now, like where I work now, I have a lot of trust with my boss in terms of the quality of my work, that I know what I'm doing. And so she will give feedback when necessary, when I ask for it. But there's also a lot of projects where I feel confident enough to take them from beginning to end without a lot of, additional layers of approval or anything like that.
Yeah, and that kind of leads me to my next question, which I think I know some of the answer that you're going to give, because I know that you've run 2 podcasts at 2 different companies, and I know it's a huge piece of how you are able to keep your pulse on the market and what people are saying. But how do you deal with the pressure of knowing that the company's story is kind of being told by you at all times?
Yeah, that's a really great question. There is some pressure for sure, especially in my current role. I host and produce our podcast. I write our newsletter. And in the beginning of every newsletter, there is a introduction, like from me. It's talking, and I often share personal anecdotes because that's just how I relate to people. Mm-hmm. And because of that, like the benefit is that our audience has gotten to know me as a person, both in terms of my role at uConnect, but also just as Meredith. And that has seemed to work really well in terms of kind of humanizing us as a company, building those relationships with our audience. So that's the benefit. But there is pressure to just kind of have it together all the time, if that makes sense. Like it's especially, I find this when I try to translate some of this to like my personal posting on LinkedIn. Like mm-hmm. I have to kind of balance that line between posting about my strategy at uConnect and not like, I never want to make our audience, many of whom I'm connected with on LinkedIn, I never want to make them feel like they're just a number or they're just someone we're trying to sell to. Like we genuinely want to help them. And so it's interesting. That has been one element of kind of being the face that I have been trying to deal with the last year or so, just trying to find that balance.
Yeah. And for me, one of the big things with being in charge of story and always focusing on, what we're going to be saying to our market is getting the market involved. I mean, that's pretty much how you and I originally met, I think, was we talked about your podcast when you were at Stoneleigh. So we both have that kind of background. And for me, one of the ways that I try to, because like I run all these strategies for all these different companies, but I also help my business partner, Tristan, to run our internal marketing for New North, Motion, Marketers in Demand. I mean, we are a small team. I mean, it's essentially 2 internal marketers and myself and Tristan who are trying to like run marketing for essentially 3 different business units. It is a lot of pressure there. And I don't feel that and it's why I'm back doing the show. It's when I was doing Motion, I did recorded content. I don't feel that I can properly tell that story without involving members of my ideal customer profile, which would be small, people who work on small marketing teams at B2B companies. I mean, it is just so essential. I was talking to somebody the other day. We were talking about, it was with one of our clients, and we were talking about a social media content calendar. And I told her, I said, we're asked to do a million different things. One of the hardest things that we're asked to do is to do someone's social content with no content engine. They don't have a podcast, a video series, an ongoing something where we're creating content. You're essentially just banging your head. You're like, I got to come up with like 30 topics for the next month. And then I got to do it
what?
again the following month. About what? And that storytelling and how we speak to our audience and what we're saying to people, to me, has to stem from something like this. I mean, that pressure, I have another example when it comes to content that I talk to people about a lot is people don't want sometimes to prep for interviews and things like this. And they're like, oh, I'll just go and, talk to somebody. I've always found that there's 10 times more pressure on that interview if I'm not prepared for it. I'm like way more nervous. I'm like, okay, I hope this goes well. And then I find if I just prepare a little bit, that pressure comes off. It's the same with telling stories on behalf of your company as a small team. Is if you have that thing that you can pluck all those stories from, it just becomes so much easier. And whether you have done it intentionally or not, I feel like that's part of your playbook as well, Meredith.
Oh, absolutely. And I know I have mentioned this in past episodes, but I do really pull a lot from my journalism background in this regard with trying to really get to the heart of the story and involving people in that storytelling process. Like, I'm not just looking at our marketing decks or whatever. I'm trying to go directly to the source and find out what our audience is saying about their challenges. And yeah, not only do I find that to be more effective, but I personally just find it more interesting. Like that's what keeps me in a role, is because those stories and those people are so fascinating.
Yeah. And that is probably going to be a similar answer to my next question, which is how you manage the isolation that you may feel as a team of one when no one else is doing what you do. And I know for myself, I mean, the way that I manage that is by talking to people in the space. I run our sales, and so I'm always on the phone with people or on Zoom. Don't really use a phone anymore. But I'm on Zoom, talking to people in the space, understanding what they're looking for, then running a podcast, talking to people like yourself, like Rachel, who we originally interviewed for this conversation. And then even for me, being, an agency owner, being involved with the clients really helps me to avoid that isolation. But for you, kind of being that small marketing team, how many people are on your marketing team? Is it two?
There's 3 marketers and 2 BDRs.
Okay, so 5-person.
Yeah.
Essentially, if BDRs are reporting up to marketing, regardless, you're the one content marketer, unless the other marketer joined your team. You could tell me about that.
It's a product marketer.
There you go. So so still very much isolated in your channel. How do you manage some of creative brainstorming, the ability to do your job, just the feeling of isolation that you may have, being the only person in your role? How do you manage that?
Yeah, it's a good question. There's a few different things that I do. So one is that I have a really great boss. Like, truly, she is fantastic when it comes to brainstorming and running ideas by her. She really understands content. And I knew that before I joined this company. And that was one of the reasons that I was very interested in joining. So I'm like, it makes such a difference to work for somebody who not only gets marketing, but they get content.
Yeah.
And how important it is. How it's basically the backbone of a lot of marketing strategies. So there's that, which is very helpful internally. And then externally,
every marketing strategy.
Yes. Yeah. Literally like the pillar, the backbone.
Yeah. I think I've told you this before, but like when people come to me and they're like, we want to run paid media. And I'm like, great. The first thing we need to do is establish what the content is going to be. They're like, no, just turn it on. I'm like,
no, it won't work.
Well, it will. Maybe I have no control over it. You could love me in a month. You could hate me in a month. I have no idea. So without content and the ability to set up a good campaign, good way to speak to people, etc., impossible. And, I talk to a lot of people, and for, content marketers like yourself who are in good situations, and I think it goes back to kind of what I was saying before, people say you want a CEO or a CMO or someone who understands the value of what you're doing. I think it's just so critical. And there are so many people out there who don't understand how it all works together. But anyway, keep going.
Yeah. Yeah. So I was going to say that's kind of my internal trick there. But externally, I do a couple different things to just kind of battle that isolation. And one is being really active on LinkedIn. Like, I don't post quite as much as I used to, but I'm still posting maybe weekly. But I'm on there every day. Like, it's pretty much open all day, every day. So I'm looking at conversations, I'm commenting, I'm trying to like be a part of the greater conversation around marketing so I can stay up to date on what's new in content marketing, what other people are doing, kind of compare and contrast what I'm doing to what I'm seeing other people talk about. And usually I leave feeling pretty good about our strategy, so that's nice and validating. And then secondly, I also try to have one-on-one conversations with other marketers fairly regularly, just like coffee chats. I'll just say, "Hey, do you want to meet up off LinkedIn and just talk?" And sometimes we're just talking about personal stuff, or we might be talking about work and comparing strategies. And one of the ways that has manifested is what Rachel talked about in our interview was these content marketing squads that she started. So the first one was, gosh, maybe like 8 of us. There weren't that many, and it was a pretty small group. We met up monthly, and it was just really helpful to talk about different challenges we were all facing. And it was especially helpful in battling that isolation because most of the time I left feeling like, okay, I am not the only one dealing with these issues. It's not just me. Like, it's kind of a systemic thing, and here's how other people are trying to address that. So those are a few different ways I try to battle that isolation. But I mean, it is tough. I'm a very extroverted, social person, so it's hard when you're especially not only the only content marketer, but you work remotely. So there's also that additional factor. So anyway, those are a few different kind of internal and external ways I address that isolation.
Do you get grilled at all? I'm just curious about this. This isn't even in my questions, but do you get grilled at all about the metrics behind your content marketing?
I don't know about grilled, but I do work with my boss to like really figure out what those kind of leading indicators are. And in the
Yeah.
past, some of those have been like website inbound leads or something that I'm responsible for. And so a lot of my content kind of feeds into that, even if it's not super salesy. Like, we purposely try to make the content not salesy, but genuinely helpful and valuable. And we have found that that works really well in
I'm
generating
such an
interest.
agency person asking grilled. Do you get asked? Are you held accountable? Should have been the way that I phrased that question.
Grilled, I think of like, again, my old journalism days with my notepad, like,
Yeah.
tell me, why did you propose this policy for the city council or something like that?
Yeah. And how do you justify in those conversations the value that content marketing brings to the table for the overarching marketing function?
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty fortunate that it seems pretty obvious because a lot of what we're doing is very visible. Like, the podcast is extremely visible. It has performed really well since we launched it last January. And we can see that not only by the number of downloads, which I frequently share updates on the number of downloads with the company. I'm like, hey, we just hit 5,000. That's exciting. I share every new episode with the company. So there is some internal marketing that goes into play there to kind of keep things top of mind.
Mm-hmm.
So there's kind of that element. And then we get a lot of feedback from our target audience. So prospects in the sales process or customers will mention that they listen to the podcast, they subscribe to the newsletter, they loved seeing us at such and such conference. So yeah, I mean, there is that internal marketing, but a lot of it is just that people are finding value in the content and they're being vocal about it, which is a nice position to be in as the content marketer.
Yeah, absolutely. Another question I have for you in terms of, it's something you mentioned a moment ago about the strategies that you're laying out, you're seeing on LinkedIn, et cetera. How do you balance the execution component of content marketing, which is, I think, heavily on you. If I understand your role correctly, I'm sure you use various vendors or help where you can, but I think a lot of the execution component falls on you. And then also the strategy part of it, mapping out what the plan is, how you're going to pivot, what new things you want to do. As a small team, how do you balance that execution component with the strategy component?
Yeah, it's really tough. This is something I struggle with a lot, even though I'm like 10 years into my content career. I think how I balance it is just, I honestly do a lot of it concurrently. Like, of course, there is this general strategy setting at the beginning of the year or the quarter. But a lot of it, and this is another perk of small team, is that we can kind of adjust and adapt as we go based on the performance of episodes, articles, LinkedIn posts, etc. And so I do honestly a lot of it kind of as I go. Mm-hmm. Like, I have my clear guidelines, my clear goals, and that definitely helps. Like, I have a certain number of LinkedIn impressions, podcast downloads, newsletter subscribers, website traffic that I'm shooting for. And so I'm just trying to figure out, how do I hit those numbers? How many podcast episodes a month do I need to shoot for? Well, I really only have capacity for 2 a month, so we're just going to go with that, see how it goes. And we just kind of figured out the cadence of all of the different pieces that we're producing and just seeing how that aligns with the strategy. So I know that's kind of a nebulous answer, but it's kind of concurrent and just, adapting as we go. Like, there's not one strategy at the beginning of the year that we stick hardcore to the rest of the year.
And I would even say that a lot of it is that you have kind of your playbook that you've been running for a while. So it's like you're almost tinkering with that playbook. We deal with something very, very similar with our client base. So, we market to small marketing teams of 0 to 5, and the vast majority of our clients are on marketing teams of 0 to 2. In many cases, we are either the first big marketing foray that they're going into, or they've done little things that have failed, etc. So we're not being handed a $50,000 a month marketing budget with a $100,000 paid media budget, and they're like, go nuts. It's like much smaller than that. You can see on our website what our average price, our average sale price is. But regardless, for us at that size of a campaign and the way that we work with people, we aren't building crazy, insane, like, marketing initiatives each time. Now, they all are custom to the client, but we have to have what we call plays, right? So it's like, for us, it's probably very similar to what your first play is like for any client that comes to us. The first thing that we do is we build out their strategy, but then we build out a content plan. Like, if we don't have content to pull from, we have nothing. So we build out the content plan, and then we build out a marketing operations plan. We need to know how everything's connected, and we need to have something to pull from. Then from there, that content plan is what can fuel other channels that we want to go into, whether that is paid media, social media, doing things, like outbound actions like ABM campaigns and things like that. But it all stems from that play, because when you have limited resources, whether for you, that's time because you only have so many hours in the day. For us, it's also time, or we actually sell what we call our points, but our clients only have so many points. So we have to make sure that we have really strong plays. And my guess is for you, it's like, yes, I'm tinkering with my strategy, as we are. We have different ideas, different things we want to roll out, but we have to have that like framework from with which to work, or then you're just kind of doing actions. And that's something that I tell my team all the time that we do not want to do as a marketing, kind of an external marketing department, is actions. Like, it all needs to stem from something and work together. And for you, I know it's been your podcast. That's really like the way. And for us, it's typically a video series or a podcast. Podcast has become a term that people don't like anymore, so we stay away from that.
Everyone does the podcast, right?
Yeah. Well, it's actually changed. It's interesting. So you're good at podcasts, so you may not even hear this, but I own a podcast agency, so I hear it very loudly because I have to know what's going on in the market. So many podcasts have failed within marketing because marketers are unable to keep up with the cadence of every other week, even if it's monthly. You're like, when you call it podcast, you are held to a standard by leadership that you're going to do something on a very specific cadence. And so we've started calling them video series on our like full service marketing agency because it doesn't give people that same level of like scared, nervous, fear. Because a video series, you still get all the same content, but you're not held to this needs to come out every 2 weeks. We could do a push at the beginning of a quarter and do 4 video recordings and put them out and then not do another one for 8 weeks. And nobody's like frustrated that the podcast isn't coming out, versus if you call it podcast and you do 4 at once and then you don't do one for 8 weeks, everyone's like, why is the podcast failing? So it's just an interesting change that we did. The output's literally the same. The only difference is whether or not we're pulling out an audio piece and it's going to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, whatever. That is the literal only difference. We pull out blog posts, videos, quote cards, thumbnails, the whole 9, all the same. But the way we frame it up is just typically depending on the client's appetite for podcast. And what we found is when people come to the podcast agency, of course, they came for podcast. But on the full service marketing side, when we say podcast to people, they're like, no, don't want that. That's scary. I don't want it. It sounds like we're going to have to do a lot of work and I'm going to be held accountable and I might fail. So that's just something that I've seen a lot. And we've kind of changed some of our marketing language because a lot of marketers out there who have failed podcasts have lost their jobs, been blamed, etc. So it's something in marketing communities. People are like, don't start a podcast. And my pushback is like, I disagree. I mean, I hear you, but just call it something different. At the end of the day, the purpose of the podcast is the outputs. Like, that's why we're doing it. I'm not trying to go get famous as a podcaster. I'm trying to use my podcast as my content marketing materials so that I have something to say to my market. I'm talking to the people in my market. So it's just something interesting. I don't know if you've heard any of that.
I have not. But I mean, it is hard. It's really hard work. Like, you were asking earlier about how I balance like the execution with the strategy. Like, making sure that everything comes out on a cadence is difficult. But like, one of my proudest things here at uConnect is that we have never missed a week. Like, it's every other Tuesday since January 2023. Like, an episode has come out, and it's just a matter of making it a priority and working in an organization that allows you to make it a priority because they also see it as a priority.
And here's the counterpoint to my point is I think right now is a better time than ever to do a podcast as a B2B company because people are fleeing that space. And the idea from 2 years ago that I heard all the time, which was, I think what you were going to say before is, I heard it's saturated. There's so many podcasts. I think I wrote about this on LinkedIn. I mean, it is there was a podcast apocalypse. There are dead podcasts littered on Apple Podcasts and Spotify from B2B companies who ran them for a year and a half, 6 months, whatever. And they were like, we can't do this cadence. They would go from, we're a weekly show. And I make more money historically when people come to me and say they want to do a weekly show. And my response to them is typically, I don't think you should do that. Like, if you don't have a bigger team, I'm terrified if you say weekly show. I watch shows with big teams fail with 1 episode per month. And so if you're a small team and you're coming to me, you're like, we're going to do a weekly show. I'm like, I will do this. I will. I definitely will. I ran a weekly show. I know what it takes, but I caution you to do a weekly show. So with all of that said, and watching all of these companies not able to sustain their podcast, I would say anyone listening to this show, go look at your space. Leave like marketing podcasts out of it. Let's say you're in like a unique space. Like I have a client who's in oncology data, right? Like very unique healthcare space. You're in like this unique space. Go look now at the podcasts in your space. And I would bet you that if there were 5, there's 2. If there were 10, there's 3. Like the pool has significantly shrunk, and our ability to retake market share within the podcast space is actually great as content marketers. So I personally am continuing to double and triple down into the space from our own podcast. We run, I think, 11 of them now that we own. Like, we're not going anywhere from this space, but the marketers out there who don't want to do what you're doing, Meredith, and say, we're going to release an episode every other week, and I'm going to go down kicking and screaming before that doesn't happen. It's fading, and it provides a good opportunity. But I also understand when people are like, that's a big ask. It's, and a lot of times it's not even in marketing's ability to do it. For you've run both of your podcasts as the host, but I also have clients who have very busy CEOs who are like, I'm the podcast person. I'm not giving up the mic. I'm going to be the voice of this company. And then they come to me on weekly meetings or whatever, and I'm like, what can we do? We had one show where I begged. It was a host and his co-host was the CEO or one of the founders. And I begged him. I was like, you got to just do the show yourself. Like, please, you're being held back. Like, you have all the tools. You don't need him there. And finally they did that, and they had an extremely successful show. So I know that in many cases, it's not even marketing's fault. It's just this like big, giant thing that people can't control that they're scared of.
Yeah. It's a lot of work, but as you were talking about like how you should look at your space, see how saturated it is, there might be a lot of podcasts, but how many of them are actually good? Like that's a question I ask myself. I'm like, okay, so they got a podcast. How's the host? How's the frequency? Like, what's the branding look like? Is it actually any good? Or is it just a podcast?
And when's the last episode that came out? That's always my favorite.
Yes,
that
exactly.
is my favorite. People will come to me and they'll be like, oh, there's another podcast with the same name. I'm like, the last episode came out in 2016. Like, I don't think that you put out 10 episodes and people search for your podcast, they're going to find your name, not the show that was out 10 years ago and stopped, or 3 years ago. Naming is tricky. There can be copyrights and stuff, so it's not exactly the best point. But the idea being that you should really look into like how well is that podcast doing? Is it good? Like you said, is it coming out consistently? Are they putting out an episode once every 3 months? Was their last episode 2 years ago? So anyway, that's my soapbox for today on the state of podcasting. That's pretty much all I had for this. Unless you had anything else, Meredith, I think that's pretty much it for today.
Yeah, I think that was a fun discussion.
Awesome. Well, audience, that was another episode of Tech Qualified. Please check us out for the next episode. Thank you, and have a great one.
Thanks for checking out Tech Qualified. This show is brought to you by New North, a marketing agency that helps turn your small, scrappy marketing team into a growth engine. To find out more about New North or check out more episodes of this show, go to newnorth.com/techqualified.